So it's a really lovely April day here in Boston. The sun is finally out, and I'm enjoying being here for once in the Leland Street Cooperative Garden. Now, this is something of a neighborhood gathering place, just a couple of minutes from my house. There's no individually owned plots, there's no fences, there's no locks, there's no keys, but there is something of a long story here. In the early 1980s, the garden was just 3 vacant lots covered in broken glass, garbage, abandoned cars. It was a pretty rough spot. But in 1983, the Boston Natural Areas Fund purchased those 3 lots, and a few years later, the garden got a big grant from the city of Boston, and that was the beginning of the cooperative garden. Now, there's lots of great things here. There's meals and concerts, beekeeping demonstrations from the hives which are kept over there, and of course, a lot of food grown in these shared plots. But food is a lot of work. It takes input, and it takes time. And turning those raw ingredients into something delicious, that's even more work, as we've seen. It takes knowledge, a sense of experimentation, of culture, and hopefully some appreciation of the stories and people that inform and produce that food. Which is why some companies are hoping to shake things up. I just ordered this bottle of Soylent from Amazon, which is a small company based in Seattle that you might have heard of or you will soon. It came via 2-day shipping in a big box with lots of plastic packing bubbles inside. Now, Soylent is something that's apparently all the rage in Silicon Valley, where it seems like folks are too busy coding to learn how to cook anything. And the company's founders say that Soylent started with the basic idea that complete nutrition shouldn't be difficult or expensive. And apparently it's a perfect blend of fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and vitamins, as well as caffeine and L-theanine, which I'm guessing is an amino acid that lets you program apps a little quicker. Not really sure. So I figured we'd see whether we could save all the hassle of community gardens and markets and groceries and making meals with your families or your friends with this delicious looking bottle of Cafe Vanilla Soylent. It's got some really exciting ingredients in it, like gellan gum, sucralose, high oleic sunflower oil, cyanocobalamin, and ergocalyferol. It sounds amazing. Let's give it a taste. Sealed. Well, that's f***ing disgusting. Wonder if Amazon takes returns of half-open Soylent bottles. Guessing they do. I should have a word with Jeff about this. Alright, stay tuned. Hey everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. We've come a long way together, tracing the history of food from the beginnings of agriculture and human taste to the rise of modern foodways. And now we've reached the present, a world of both great opportunities for novelty and new forms of pleasure, as well as the prospect of imminent crisis, from the specter of climate change stoked on by modern agriculture to the dynamics of both undernutrition and overnutrition wreaking havoc on human health and the planet. Now, at the heart of this paradox really is the idea of choice. Choice is a hallmark of democratic society, but also of consumer society more broadly. And nearly every country around the world, regardless of its stated political ideology, has bought in pretty heavily to the supremacy of consumer society. The idea that we make decisions about who we are through the things that we purchase. Now that plays out in all sorts of different ways, in the clothes we wear, in the cars we might drive or not drive, the trips that we take or might not take. But food is the area where the idea of choice and the fraught nature of those choices seem to be linked the most viscerally. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. There's 2 parts to this conversation. The first is a very quick look at how we got to where we are today, from the opening of the very first self-service grocery store in 1916 to the plethora of choices that we have for consuming foods right now. We'll think about how ideas of distinction through consumption grew alongside modern agribusiness, and try to see whether it's consumption that drives production or whether it's producers and marketers who are really having the last laugh. Then we'll turn our attention to the question of the high costs that our consumption models have upon farmers, our planet, and our bodies, and try to see whether there are options for breaking out of that cycle. Let's get started. A while back, we talked about the rise of American models of agribusiness, tracing them to California's efforts to irrigate farms in the San Joaquin and the Sacramento River valleys during the New Deal. And then moving on to the Cold War, I hinted at the ways in which big agriculture in the United States, as well as in the Soviet Union, was propped up by certain types of farm lobbies, and increased subsidies for the biggest farms at the cost of smaller ones. We won't really dwell on that story here, but it's in the background of the story that I'm going to tell about American food consumption, which increasingly is the model for global food production. There had to be a steady supply of raw and finished products being produced in order for any of this to take shape. The notion of consumer sovereignty is one that we almost take for granted today. That's the idea that consumers' desires and choices scale up to influence production decisions. It's the idea of voting with your dollar or with your fork. Consumer sovereignty is the idea that it's pretty easy for firms to discern what sorts of goods or customers or consumers want, and that in turn they're going to work to produce them. But there's also a school of thought that says that consumer sovereignty is a myth. It doesn't really exist. It's marketers and advertisers who help firms persuade consumers to buy things that they don't really want or need. In reality, the situation is probably a little more complex and nuanced. Consumers probably do exert a certain type of influence on firms, but at the same time, consumer preferences aren't created in a vacuum all by themselves. The idea of consumer sovereignty is at the heart of the supermarket. The operating principle in a supermarket, whether you're grabbing a shopping cart, moving through with purpose to find a few items, or just following the aisles to see what's interesting or new, that's choice. It's the idea that your desires in the aggregate will be met by the supermarket itself. And this, of course, is a relatively new phenomenon. It has its roots in the marketing campaigns that we talked about that help make the idea of industrial food palatable, whether those of H.J. Heinz or the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. But it also began to take more concrete form in 1916. And that was the year that Piggly Wiggly was founded. It was the world's first self-service grocery store. Piggly Wiggly, it's a funny name, was founded in Memphis, Tennessee, and it came up with an innovation that would change the modern grocery store. Rather than customers handing a clerk a list of groceries, it allowed customers to go through the store and gather the goods themselves. Piggly Wiggly no longer needed to hire clerks to find groceries for customers, so their prices went down. And while there was the institution of a new form of property theft, shoplifting, there was also a new phenomena that gladdened marketers from this point on. That was impulse purchasing. Piggly Wiggly put a patent on the self-serving store the year after it opened in 1917, and it franchised out the idea. It secured a pretty good early lead on the market, but it didn't last for that long. There were a lot of competitors. By the 1930s, Piggly Wiggly had been farmed out into regional chains, things that you might recognize today like Kroger or Safeway. The invention of the grocery store was a pre-war phenomenon, but it began to pick up pace in a new way after the Second World War, alongside the growth of consumer society more generally. As early as 1899, the sociologist Thorsten Veblen had come up with the term conspicuous consumption to describe purchases that were primarily made to show off prestige and social status, rather than just to enjoy the practical utility of certain goods or services. But this phenomena became more and more pronounced in the 1950s and 60s. And once again, California played a really outsized role in this story. California was the place of American dreams, first of gold and then of movies. But it was also the place where in 1967, Joe Colomb, an ambitious grocer and businessman from San Diego, purchased a chain of grocery stores which he would soon rename Trader Joe's. Colomb was a savvy businessman, and he saw the demographic trends that would shape the United States over the next 50 years. Greater education, but also stagnant and declining finances. And above all else, a desire for consumers to express their own social distinction through what they purchased. By the way, that term distinction is one that would be coined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu in 1979. He argued those with the highest volume of cultural capital, like education, would also be those who determined what constituted taste in a given society. And this idea was really at work at Trader Joe's, which sold items that weren't necessarily household basics like milk and bread and eggs, but rather items like cheese and wines that showed how much distinction consumers had, to themselves or to others. Marketers in a later era would think of this as trend forecasting, but really it was Joe himself who was responsible for that innovation. All of this was taking place as big grocery chains were continuing to solidify their regional dominance. But there were other developments occurring that would solidify the importance of taste and distinction in the types of groceries that people buy. Natural food stores had become more and more important to counterculture consumers throughout the 1960s and 70s. And in 1978, a college dropout named John Mackey founded a small vegetarian health food store in Austin, Texas called Safer Way. It was a play on Safeway. A few years later, after merging with another natural food store, Mackey renamed the store the Whole Foods Market, which foregrounded natural and organic foods. These were for customers with discerning tastes and relatively high incomes. The scholar Julie Guthman would later on come up with a phrase for this kind of food, yuppie chow. Whole Foods grew massively over the next several decades, though that growth began to slow in the mid-2010s, and in 2017, it was of course acquired by Amazon. That acquisition pointed to another dynamic, which was the greenwashing of big agriculture under the pretext of consumer sovereignty. Throughout the last half of the 20th century, the scale of industrial agriculture began to grow, as did American consumption patterns. In 1976, a businessman named Saul Price, once again from California, founded a company called Price Club. It was the world's first retail warehouse club where, for a membership fee, customers could buy wholesale quantities of vetted, higher quality goods. Within a few years, that company had merged with another retailer named Costco, which was the birth of an American consumption behemoth. Before long, there were other companies vying for a piece of that growing retail market, like BJ's and Sam's Club. All of these companies, in some ways, realized that alongside volume, one of the most important factors in selling to American consumers was the idea of distinction, which they did through notions of quality or through vague notions of health or environmentalism. Even the biggest retailers got in on the act. The American chain Walmart became, by the second decade of the 21st century, the world's largest producer of organic produce, even as most critics of consumer society argue that the scale of American consumption by itself precludes any real idea of sustainability. The scale of American retail and global retail grew exponentially over the course of the 20th century. The biggest supermarkets of the pre-war era were around 6,000 square feet. By the end of the 1950s, though, the average supermarket was 18,000 square feet. And a Costco or a Walmart today averages around 200,000 square feet. The rise of home delivery, both groceries and prepared meals, that stands to change the ways in which food is distributed in the United States and around the world, but it isn't really likely to reduce its scale. It doesn't seem likely that consumers themselves created their own growing appetites. Rather, they were stoked on by marketers and retailers who were eager to produce the illusion that consumers needed more and more distinct types of food. One of the ways that this was done was through the notion that we talked about last time of ethical consumerism. The idea of ethical consumerism sounds good. It's the idea of, again, voting with our plates or our forks or our dollars. But in some ways, that's also the core of an ideology that we think of as neoliberalism. The idea that responsibilities are transferred away from companies or governments to individuals, and that it's those individuals' responsibility to make up for the areas where regulation or better policy has failed. In some ways, our focus on consumption really directs attention away from questions of social justice or class inequality, and it does seem to steer the conversation away from questions of labor. It's also a form of really low-level, easy activism that really just empowers those with the financial capital needed to buy the right products. To think through the question of consumer sovereignty and choice and just how much influence advertising and marketing have upon those questions, I reached out to Professor Emily Contois. Dr. Contois is a graduate of Boston University's gastronomy program, and she's the Chapman Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa. She's the author of a fantastic new book called Diners, Dudes, and Diets: How Gender and Power Collide in Food, Media, and Culture. This book looks at the rise of a category that Dr. Contois calls dude food, which links together powerfully and historically specific ideas about masculinity to a range of items and practices. She's also hard at work editing a new book on food and Instagram. Here's what she had to say.
I'm Emily Contois. I am an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Tulsa. And broadly, I work on food, the body, and cultural notions about health, and particularly how all that circulates in media and popular culture. I was a letters major in undergrad, so I was like history, literature, and philosophy, and ancient language, and a modern language. But there was so much flexibility in that I could focus on food and health and culture, and sort of think about nutrition science as well as a cultural idea. So I wrote my honors thesis on the language of of diet culture, diet books and the diet menus and women's magazines that were all around me. And so the beginnings of my book that came out this year, like they were when I was 20, 21 years old doing that scholarship. And then I know you're at Boston University. I did the master's in liberal arts and gastronomy there. So I was trained with a terminal degree in food studies at that master's level before I did my PhD in American studies. So American studies gave me a place to go deeper and to put all of that food studies knowledge within a broader, longer, more complex context and structure. But like food studies is a big part of how I still get to define myself. And I was so lucky to land in a media studies department that thinks that food studies is media studies. They see food as another medium, as a way of connecting us, as a channel, as a set of signifiers, signs, and symbols. So in this book, I argue that the dude is a kind of masculinity. He's a particular kind of guy in that he is the slacker hero, right? He is the average or below average guy. And I'm looking at him in a particular historical moment, this Great Recession era in the United States. Because the fact is that gender doesn't really exist, right? It's this social and cultural construct. It is only what we make it. And it's through the repetition of things like food media, advertising, Hollywood movies, magazines, all these things that repeat particular ideas about gender to us that we then come to accept as if they're natural. And so the dude pushed back against some of these norms of masculinity, that he wasn't going to be ripped, he wasn't going to be a breadwinner, that he was going to slack off. And so I'm looking at him within that Great Recession moment because all of those norms of masculinity became even more impossible. And so the dude's able to navigate some of that at the same time that he holds up these existing structures of power. He does nothing for feminism. He does nothing to dismantle white supremacy. He just makes it a little bit easier for some men to be men. And so dude food is like this culinary genre that goes along with that ethos. It's breaking the rules and doing whatever it wants. It breaks the boundaries of, flavor profile. It's hugely spicy or hugely salty. It's not just one burger patty, it's 5, right? It takes this level of exaggeration to the next degree. It thinks about nutritional rules, how it thinks about social class, how it thinks about food waste, ideas about health. It has this ironic pushing of the boundaries built into it. So that's the theoretical perspective. We could talk about specific examples of that. The one that I love to show is not just your classic cheeseburger, which we all love and we all need sometimes. Like a dude food burger is going to have 2 or 3 patties. It's going to have fried onion rings thrown in there. It's going to have some jalapeno something. And then I know I've seen versions that instead of buns, it got grilled cheese sandwiches, right? It is this exaggerated version of a comfort food. So I ended up describing and defining it as comfort food with an edge of competitive destruction. Are you man enough to be able to eat? I look at how the food media and marketing industries took all those precedents of dude food and tried to apply them to these supposedly feminized foods like diet soda, yogurts, and to go on a diet in general, right? Things like vegetables and salads and quote unquote healthy eating. How did they try and use this dudishness to convince men that it was okay to be able to drink diet soda? And so that happens on a number of levels, whether it's the package design or the actual naming conventions. I talk about the concept of zero to define and diet approach, how we talk about these sorts of things to men because of that perception of femininity and feminization. I think what I'm so interested in are the marketing messages that they're attempting to communicate, and then seeing how and when consumers accept that reading, or when they push back, right? When is it a negotiation that they're actually creating different meaning? And so in the case of both things like Diet Coke and yogurt, there are plenty of men who were eating and drinking those products before these campaigns or these new products came out. So part of this argument about gender contamination, right? This idea that consumers fear products, particularly men, right? Not wanting to consume products that are perceived as feminine. I have questions about how much of that is coming from marketers themselves versus how actual individuals are perceiving these foods or ways of eating and how they make sense of them within themselves. So, like in a lot of families, the food work, all that labor was done by the women in my family. So, that's not just cooking and cleaning up, that's managing the pantry, managing a tight family budget, that's finding recipes that everyone will like and eat, doing all of that shopping and management, and then the labor of actually making the food and putting it on the table. But in my family on Thanksgiving, my mom and grandma would cook it together, but my grandmother never sat down to eat with us. She ate a lean cuisine meal instead. And so she didn't take part in this hugely cultural, meaningful feast that was special in my family the way it is in a lot of others. That for her, the eating disorder that characterized a lot of her adult life got in the way. And so I knew from really early on, from her and then from my own experiences, that food certainly, right, was this source of joy and connectivity and culture and pleasure. But it was also about anxiety. It was also about tension. It was also about contradictions. It was a source of paradox. It was a place where we navigated ideas about control. And so I've always been interested in that messiness, right? Of how it brings us together and tears us apart. It can fuse us and cause fractures. That food is this really fascinating space in both of those ways. I remember when I was 20 writing my undergrad thesis, it was Susan Bordeaux's work of feminist philosophy so influenced me, of thinking about the double bind of consumer capitalism, to consume and to restrain, to be virtuous and to give in to our pleasures. And lots of folks point to that rise of industrial capitalism at the end of the 19th century as this moment where we worry about fat bodies, where we see the rise of diet culture, and that shifts as it becomes very feminized. At first, it's about maintaining like white masculine authority in a world that is changing in profound, complicated ways. So that anxiety has been there for a long time. And I think if we tease it, if we follow it and keep unpacking it, then it actually has a lot of stories to tell that can get us to a place of critical, conscious joy. A lot of people ask me, like, how I started researching dude food and sort of these different products that were made for men. And a lot of it is stuff that my husband brings home. Like, he's an extreme athlete. He's always bringing home the next protein thing and weird waters and all sorts of recovery beverages. And so a lot of the time, what he's bringing home are these new products, right? The ones where they're trying to get you to buy it for the first time, putting them on end caps to draw the eye in. Like advertising in supermarkets for more than 100 years, I've been trying to think about how to make us buy things based on impulse, not based upon what we need, and to get us to try new things. I went to a grocery store for the first time in a really long time over the weekend, and it was a discount grocery store. And I had the smallest produce section I've ever seen, and I got really sad. But I think my favorite grocery store ever was Berkeley Bowl when we were living, in downtown when I was going to Berkeley. And just the idea that half the store was produce, right? Like the most beautiful lettuce, a million different kinds of apples. That was the verdant, amazing affluences we think about what abundance, right? Pastoral abundance looks like in the supermarket. Because that's not what the supermarket's really trying to sell us. It's often about products and packaging and brand images. And so from a research perspective, I always find that really fascinating. I'm often taking photographs and, thinking about what's going on in that space. I can't turn off my brain even when we're going grocery shopping. I have had the opportunity a couple of times to consult and to give presentations with folks who are designing campaigns, coming up with brands, doing product ideation, like all that kind of stuff. And I teach the history of the advertising industry with my students. And from the beginning of that rise of modern advertising in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in the United States, like advertising was always this field for the most modern of men and women. These were really educated, really forward thinking, like they would have thought they were very progressive and liberal, and it was their job to help the American people become modern. And I sometimes see that with advertisers today because I'm so interested in these questions of sort of identity, right? How is food marketing and then lots of other, right, product categories trying to tell us ideas, right, about who we can be, whether it's about gender or about race or about our sexualities. And so there are definitely, limitations, right? Pink washing, rainbow washing, green washing, right? These do absolutely no good. And so I am intrigued by this idea of how brands can be a part of conversations, lead conversations, and actually do good work. Like, I think there is genuine opportunity there. And I had really satisfying conversations with folks who work in branding. They're really smart, thoughtful people as they think about the work that they're doing. Their hands are sometimes tied behind their back in all the different demands that they're trying to reach and assess all at the same time. But I see more hope there in some ways. I don't know, like the public health argument of like, how do we actually work with fast food? We haven't really pushed that at all. I don't know where that's ever going to go. But I think in working with branding, like I think sometimes they think they're already on our side. And so helping them see the moments where they're falling short or how their obsession with trends and futurity and what's coming next. My job is always to take the things that they know and put them in cultural context and a long historical lineage. That's what academics can bring to these conversations with brands. When I go back to all the histories of food and diet advice, right? Like people get confused about what to eat when like the real true principles of like plants, balance, and moderation have been there since the beginning of sort of humans figuring out how to satiate themselves. And so I think it's at the extremes we're going to run into trouble. And because my work started in diet culture, right? Like it's okay to experiment with things, particularly if you've discovered something about your health or your body, that changing the way you eat or cutting something out genuinely makes you feel better. But to really cut out a food group or to become obsessed with a particular macronutrient or to eat only in one particular way all the time, like why would you limit yourself to that I preach a responsible omnivorousness, right? That you can be vegan some days and have a steak on very special occasions, right? That there are ways that everything we eat, right, fits into who we are. That when we are critical consumers, we recognize that balance is a big part of the joy of life.
The world of consumption and marketing is worth lingering on. And at the same time, we have to think bigger as we look towards the future and try to envision the world of food and agriculture that we want to create. All of this is complicated by the dawning reality that climate change is going to change everything about our food system. Food will become more expensive, scarcer, and it's going to be distributed more and more unequally. What we are doing today to make food for a planet that's growing ever more American in its consumption patterns is quite literally unsustainable. It's built upon cheap oil and government subsidies for pesticides, fertilizers, and transportation. If the entire world were to adopt the food system of the United States in 2021, we'd use all remaining sources of fossil fuel on Earth in just 7 years. The term food justice and sustainability, those have come to prominence lately, and in some ways they might be seen a bit generously as referring to the same idea. The notion that our food systems today are flawed and that they might be remade so that they offer a fairer deal to human health, to labor, and to the planet, while meeting the food needs of different communities with some greater degree of equity. At the same time, those terms can be a bit hollow, more vague than they are clarifying. In 1996, a group of farmers from the Via Campesina movement coined the term food sovereignty, which they later defined as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. That definition is pretty lofty, and it sounds good, but it doesn't necessarily give us a program for how to proceed. So as we envision the future, it might be useful for us to discuss two big ways of thinking about the future: the so-called technological fix and the sociological fix. The first idea of the technological fix is that we'll eventually come up with a silver bullet that will help us escape the hard calculations of labor, ecology, and consumption. People imagine that silver bullet in different ways. It could be the work of so-called miracle foods that produce more, offer greater nutrition, or greater resilience to climate or other factors, something like a second green revolution. It could be a genetically modified organism or cellular agriculture or something else altogether. These can be fantastical ideas or pretty realistic ones, but the shared premise is that it's going to be a new set of technological inventions that will lead us to planetary salvation. By contrast, the second idea of the sociological fix holds that fundamentally it has to be our behavior that will shift the gears of the food system. By being, say, vegetarian or vegan or pescatarian, we might change the way that food is produced. There's other models here too, the idea of slow food or valorizing traditional foodways and cuisines or eating just local food, the idea of eating things which reduce your carbon output and emphasize local food resilience or food sovereignty. When you go to a farmer's market, you're buying into that kind of model. And I think that's a good model and ties our lived values to more lofty and abstract ones, but there's also limits to it. That vision generally relies really heavily upon those same ideas of ethical consumerism that we've been discussing and already see as kind of problematic. Both of these models, though, are pretty incomplete. They leave out the work of activism, of regulation, and of more systemic change. It's really easy for us to pin all of our hopes on either the technological fix or the sociological fix, and to think of either one of them or both as enough. But they don't make a lot of space for collective action, for organizing, for cultivating deep knowledge about our complex food systems, and then finding space to make change within them. A global food system that creates both malnutrition and overnutrition while exploiting workers, causing unnecessary suffering to the animals bound up in it, and bringing our Earth precariously close to the end of its cultivatable lifespan, that all requires major change, and campaigns that go much further than just these simple fixes. I wanted to talk to someone who's thinking about how to tie together some of these approaches. And so I reached out to another graduate of Boston University's gastronomy program, Giselle Kennedy-Lord. Giselle began her career as a documentary videographer, specializing in food and agriculture. After her work at BU, where she was a James Beard National Scholar for her thesis on Lebanese food in Argentina, Giselle became Director of Communications for Slow Food USA. I reached out to Giselle to talk about food politics and the future of food. Here's some of what she had to say.
I'm Giselle Kennedy-Lord, that's my full name, and I'm originally from California. I live in Oregon. I work as the communications director for an organization called Slow Food USA. It's an international organization, and obviously I work for the USA sort of arm of it. It's been around for 30 years now. It was born in Italy as a sort of resistance to the fast food movement and the way the fast food sort of industry was bleeding into every place and every life. I got this job shortly after graduating from the BU Masters in Gastronomy program. And before I went to BU, I worked for many years as a freelance video producer, but I specialized in food and agriculture, mostly because I was interested in it and I wanted to learn more. And I did documentary style videography. My mom is from Beirut, Lebanon, so I grew in. My dad's from San Francisco with Eastern European heritage and parents, but my mother immigrated here when she was young, and so it was part of this sort of odd wave of very assimilated migrants and immigrants. And in the world, we were American, although my mom looks very Lebanese, it's very obvious. But I always say my mom is most Lebanese in the kitchen, all of my family members. And there was this sort of like magic to that I didn't think as a kid, I really was conscious of how much I loved it. It was just so warm, and all of the women in my family would just gather in a kitchen around a pot and everybody had their thing. My aunt makes rice, my grandmother makes the stuffed grape leaves, my mom makes a tabbouleh. And I really liked that rhythm. I was really drawn to it. And also, as I got a little older, I got really curious about being Lebanese. And food was my route to learn more about who I am and my culture and my heritage, and also to connecting with the people around me, namely, in that case, my family. I think Lebanese people have a reputation for complex and laborious dishes when it comes to a holiday or a special celebration. So I had a penchant for food and like getting around the table with people, but at the same time, I was growing up with parents who came from the convenience food era. And so it was a strange combination of like frozen fish sticks and then kibbeh that was prepared over the course of a day. I had no exposure to agriculture at all. Or my dad grew strawberries in the backyard, and it was like my favorite thing about our home. And then when I went to college, I went to college at the University of San Francisco. I had one very special professor who had a farm in Humboldt, and was growing her own food. And she was my introduction to the connection between growing that food and preparing that food. I got really interested in the agricultural side of things and then spent a lot of time with cookbooks. I went to school for video production. And then I had a sort of formative conversation with a friend that was like, if you're so into food and agriculture, why don't you specialize in that? So I did. And I worked with farmers and I got to learn about food and agriculture with the people I was working with and interviewing and filming. After several years of doing video, I started to lose interest in like the camera equipment and all this stuff. I was just so much more interested in the people I was interviewing than the video I was making necessarily. So I started thinking about how to expand on that interest and everything I had learned and the people I had connected with over the years. So I started looking into graduate programs. I remember looking at BU gastronomy and I was like immediately smitten. I think I saw the cookbooks class Erin Mathaney teaches. I came to BU with pretty specific idea about what I wanted to study. Slow food was really appealing to me because there are a lot of major tenets of slow food, all of which I feel like I'm living. I live a very slow food life as an eater, as a cook, and as a sort of like agricultural enthusiast, if you will. But there's a heavy focus on food culture and tradition and like honoring those cultures and traditions and paying really close attention to where our food comes from and not just the dishes, but the ingredients. And this is the thing that excites me most about slow food is the arc of taste. It's a list of heirloom and heritage and rare vegetables and fruits and meat and seafood and all manner of things, many of which are in danger of disappearing. And I was really drawn to that. The almost oversimplified mission statement of Slow Food USA, because it's international and it has to be fairly broad, is good, clean, and fair food for all. Slow food started in Italy at the base of the Spanish Steps. McDonald's was planning to build a location there. And of course, Italy is steeped in history and culture, and it's a high value for that culture and society, which is delightful. And a group of people came to the Spanish Steps and they all brought dishes of like pasta dishes. I think they set up this big long table. They essentially had a potluck in the middle of the street and they were chanting, "We don't want fast food, we want slow food." And the group that kind of put that together, then including Carlo Petrini, went from there and said, what if we form an organization based on this principle that it's important to maintain the tradition and culture of our food and foodways for reasons more than it's enjoyable and delicious. And what if we can form an organization around that and name what those reasons are? So the reason this mission they came up with was good, clean, and fair. Good refers to that cultural and traditional piece for the most part, and also the enjoyment of food. We want to maintain tradition. We want to honor the cultures and people from which our food comes. Clean is in reference to the environmental impact of food, essentially, that growing food needs to be in line with taking care of the environment and ensuring that we have a future in agriculture. So scary and tenuous time in that regard. And slow food is a proponent of all food, meat, seafood, all of it. But the idea is that it should be good for the earth and also good for the people that grow it or catch it or raise it. And that's where the fair piece comes in. So that's really about everyone along the food chain getting treated fairly and equitably, which this last year has been so interesting there because I think it has revealed so many of the ways that's not happening for restaurant workers, for farm workers, for fishermen, for indigenous people who are holding on to rights they should have absolutely, but are being threatened. And then for all, of course, like the idea that we all should be able to eat well and that the systemic and policy change we want to see is really about that if there are places in this country where people just don't have access to fresh food at all, let alone rare varieties of food and interesting food, just straight up no food, then that's an issue. And we continue to push against it or try to work towards policy that will change that. I think that this is a common impression that we just eat hamburgers and pizza and everybody drinks too much soda. And in some parts of the US, I think that's probably true. And I think the idea that the US is void of food culture or food tradition is complex. There are regional food cultures that are really strong, most of which come from somewhere else because of the people that brought them there. The South is the thing that immediately comes to mind. I've taken a great interest in the South lately because it's like fascinating and delicious, and I find it very charming, and also it's a really rough history. And that, when I say we're not assigning sort of credit to the right people or places, that is a great example of that. Southern food culture is a pretty strong and pretty well-defined food culture, and it largely comes from slaves that came there and became cooks in those kitchens, and they came with this embodied and embedded knowledge of how to grow rice, how to grow greens, and they brought seeds with them and all this stuff. I feel like just now we're starting to, there's some really amazing voices in the South who are starting to say, hey, we need to pay attention to where this came from. So then it calls into question, is that an American food culture? I think yes, but the roots of that food culture are really important because the deepest part of the roots are not in the United States. And I think the same, I'm from Los Angeles, and you could argue the same about Southern California and the American Southwest. It's essentially, if you look at the food culture there are parts of it that are like just part of Mexico. What's amazing about food in the United States is that we have so many different food cultures and traditions represented. I think the miss is taking care of and respecting the people who create them and make them available to us. I'm Middle Eastern, so I have an extra sensitivity to that. I get a little frustrated when I see like it's a Middle Eastern restaurant. Okay, but there's a lot of countries in the Middle East, and within each of those countries, they each have their own regional food cultures and national food cultures. When you're talking about the Middle East, the idea of national is tricky too, because nobody gets to own hummus. It just is not a thing. Hummus was there before those borders were there. Now I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift, and Middle East is a little different because I think a lot of those restaurant owners were afraid to call their restaurant Jordanian or Iranian or Iraqi or Lebanese or whatever it is, Israeli, for political reasons and because of the way they were treated when they came here and started restaurants. And I think that's the opportunity in the cultural food that we have, is it's the opportunity to see people and to respect them and to hold them close and recognize that so much of the food culture and our world of food in the United States and the pieces of it that we love the most are from immigrants. There's two things that come to mind here. One is big agriculture, that the more we go away from small scale farming, because small scale farming isn't just about like Susan and Gerald have their farm and they want to keep it. It's also about biodiversity, which is crucial for the survival of our planet, frankly. And small scale farms are much more able to do that, to say we're going to grow these 10 varieties and do so in a way that is regenerative instead of just taking like from the soil. Soil can die, and I think that this is something that we don't, like as a society, have fully grasped, that you can go so far on a piece of land to the point where it might be impossible to bring it back to a place where it can grow anything, but maybe the one thing you've grown 400 acres of, and it won't be able to do that without major chemical inputs, which is what's happening. So we have these huge monocrops and feedlots. I think those are like the two easy to grab things that are like, the problem there is that it does not promote biodiversity. It does great harm to our climate and environment simply in the concentration. I'm looking out the window right now because I'm surrounded by orchards. And it's an interesting place to be because there's a lot of people here who are like third, fourth generation, and they're doing it the way they've always done it, which involves a good amount of chemical input. And it's harder to do it without the chemical input. But the reason it's harder is because yields might be lesser, or you need a bigger workforce. And I think that if we start to value biodiversity because we have to for the climate, that there are models that are being built right now that really can work. And we have to move from these models of big agriculture to models of maybe more cooperative agriculture. What we do now on these orchards is really going to have an effect on this land forever. It's really hard to acquire that land in the first place, which is a really big issue. Land ownership is a major problem, especially if you want to get into conversations about equity. I think 2% of farmland is owned by Black farmers, and that's crazy to me. Like, that's so low. That's almost nothing. Big ag is well supported by the government, and I think that's problematic, and we need to move away from that. I'm always saying, what if all of the subsidies we gave to big ag, we gave to cooperative models and small scale agriculture? I actually currently live on a working farm, and my good friend is the farmer, and she started last year a cooperative. Her and a handful of other farmers. You can buy your stuff online and then go pick up your box, and your box will contain products that come from 8 different farms if that's what you ordered. And makes it they're pooling their resources, their time, their energy in order to lessen the work and the burden on every individual in this cooperative, which is what a farmer's market is. We are often grappling with this like elitism thing. And slow food in the past has been a bit of a wine club. Slow Food USA really leaned really hard, especially last year, to say, okay, we need to be much more forward about our views on social justice and equity and accessibility. Our planet won't make it if all we have is 400-acre corn farms and like 400 cows stuffed into one tiny building. And it's also incredibly unhealthy for us. If it's bad for the earth, it's not good for you. You also have to make a choice that if this stuff is available to me, close to me, from people who grow it around me and they do it well, I have to make a choice to go to them, to maybe pay a higher price, maybe not. I spend more time buying food than the average American because I go to the farmer's market, and then I go to the farm, and then I go to the grocery store, and then I go to that little tiny market. And when I got to Boston and Cambridge, there's a lot of good food out there. You got to go find it and make a choice. The average American, what they spend on food, what percentage of their income is really, really low. And so that's a choice. You're making a choice. But like, they might drive a really nice car, and their car payment is high, and their rent is high. I make a choice to spend a much higher piece of my pie on food because I love it. I don't think there's anything better I could spend my money on. Start simply. That's kind of what I did. For many years, I didn't eat any red meat because I got irked by the way beef was raised. And then I thought, okay, if I want to do it right, I have to figure it out. And I remember when I first moved to Hood River, my brother came to visit, and we were going to make kibbeh, which is a Lebanese dish we grew up with. And you need ground lamb. We make it with lamb. And I took him to a farm. It's like a funny, very charming, like you go to the freezer, you take what you want, you leave your money. There's this whole thing happening for him where you just leave a check there. Like, what if you just take the meat? I'm like, you just don't. You don't, because you value these farmers and they need to be paid for their product. And also he was like, you're going to pay $10 a pound for this stuff? And I was like, absolutely. This is a choice that I'm making. So in order to get red meat back into my life, which frankly, I really like red meat, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a choice to pay a higher price because I want to eat the good stuff. And then we made the kibbeh, and he was floored. He was like, this is really good. It tastes different than mom's because mom was getting it at Albertsons or whatever. The meat, the quality of your ingredients is going to immediately dictate the quality of your meal. If you're a student and you don't have a lot of money or whatever, like, sure, you have to make a choice there. And Boston's an expensive city. I was there. But maybe you're going to eat out less so that you can bring better stuff into your kitchen. Or maybe when you do eat out, you're paying attention to like how the restaurant is sourcing their food, where they're getting it from. I think it just needs to become a priority and a value in order to make that impact on the food system around us. Start with one thing at a time. For me, I think it was probably vegetables. I think I started getting a CSA in San Francisco, and I was introduced to many vegetables where I'm like, I have no idea what this thing is or what to do with it, which was like a game for me. you get one, I get a kohlrabi, and then you have to figure out what is it? What do I do with it? Do I like it? And I also grow my own food, but of course that requires space that not everybody has. There's this funny thing that's happening in slow food. I don't have a strong opinion about it. The idea of voting with your fork. And the reason for that is because there's this idea that it overrides, like, you need to get involved in actually voting and making policy change and pushing policy change. So learning about what is the Farm Bill, what's in it, what impacts will it have, like what else is coming up for legislation. And a lot of that legislation and policy gets colored in a way that if you read it, you're like, oh, this is really different than what it sounds like. So that's the pushback on the vote with your fork idea, is the idea that it makes people think, well, if I just eat at the right restaurants and shop at my farmer's market, then I'm doing everything I can, but really we need to get involved and actually vote. I don't know how much of my income I spend on food, but I'm sure it's high. It's like double, triple the average American. But I'm healthy and I really enjoy eating, and I feel really good about where that money is going. And I think that's the thing too, is that I have benefited from a great deal of privilege, and I'm making a choice, and I've worked hard and I make enough money to feed myself well and buy the food that I want. And I kind of figure if we can lift up these food systems and these food producers, then it might make it more possible and more accessible to the people who don't have the resources or the privilege that I have.
It's easy to feel a bit overwhelmed when considering the scale of food politics and the problems that are really facing our food and agriculture system. But as I wrap things up for Taste, Culture, and Power, I want to echo what I've heard a lot of our guests say in different ways. The most important thing that you can do as you ponder the future of food is to think critically about your role within it. And not to take your food politics for granted, but to come to some explicit beliefs about what you do and don't value. That's going to change over time, it has to. But cultivating some reflexivity and awareness about why we eat the way we eat is the first step towards bigger change. And then start putting those values into practice. Some of those changes may be pretty small. And in fact, I think those are the best ones to start with. You might choose to eat less meat. You might choose to eat more seasonally or locally, or to patronize restaurants and markets that uphold standards of labor that you yourself value. I wouldn't be surprised if those actions inspire you to other forms of involvement. Organizing, the work of advocacy, and the task of change in the institutions that you're a part of, whether those are schools, workplaces, churches, mosques, and temples, or less formal groups where food plays an important role. It's basically every group as I'm concerned, and it's even a family or a group of housemates. Try to avoid thinking in terms of silver bullets or quick fixes, knowing that the work of change takes a really long time, and it's the result of many small decisions and choices that are eventually yoked together into one. Thanks for accompanying me on this journey, from the beginnings of agriculture to the present and future of our food system. It's been a lot of fun for me talking with you and with some of the most exciting people in food and agriculture today, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. I'll leave things here, so again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you down the road.